I said last Sunday, I want this year to be one really focused on the person of Jesus. And today is kind of the perfect time for that to commence in a systematic way. I'm kind of scrambling to make it up on the fly, but I'm planning on today being the first part of 4 in a series called Jesus and Creation, because why not start at the beginning? Part 1 today is Discerning God through Creation. Part 2 will be Discerning God as Trinity through Creation. Part 3 will be Jesus, Sin and Fallen Creation. And Part 4, Jesus, Personhood and Consciousness. It's probably going to be a weird lecturary. That's a terrible way of saying it. And it's loosely attends to the readings and themes of the day. But I really hope that it actually does set your minds and your hearts on fire with wonder and interest, because it will be interesting. Now, people come to acknowledge the reality and being of God through a number of different ways. But one of the mediums which is most fundamental, most intuitive, and most accessible is through the natural world. As Paul says in Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been seen and understood through the things God has made. But then, having that as a starting point, an awareness of divinity, how then can we proceed to make further claims about that divinity? Is that divinity made of one being or multiple? Is it benevolent towards humanity? What are the characteristics, qualities, and intentions of whatever the divine substance is? Is divinity actually transcendent of creation, or is it more like us in being an entity within time and space that has a beginning and an end? You'd be hard-pressed to move beyond such questions and conclude as a matter of course that the divine person has priorities such as Jesus speaks of in the synagogue, as we heard today. Concrete actions arising from a particular ethical framework which are aligned with the intentions of an interested divine being. How do you make that leap? In terms of a very, very rich spiritual sensibility of sensing God through creation, Australian Aboriginal persons have a claim to being particularly attuned. So in Noongar territory, which subdivides into 14 different language groups, stretching from Geraldton in the north to Merredin in the east and Esperance in the southeast, they've got potent myths which tell of sacred activity in and through the land. And much like the ancient Hebrew people had stories of places, like here's the place where such and such happened and we learned this about God, and to this day that's why we call it whatever it is, so do the Aboriginal people. And I want to clarify this point. When I use the word myth, sometimes that can have connotations as being just an untrue story. But I really mean it, I think in its truest sense, of a foundational story which describes the reasons for why things are the way they are. They really, myths seek to convey truth in regards to existential questions of the human experience, whilst drawing on place, symbols, rituals, story. So the point is, for many peoples, I think actually all of them, historically, all around the world, On every continent, the presence of a sacred otherness is intuited and lived with as a reality. That is the starting point. But as said, even if you can claim that there is a divine reality, you can't really go on and describe what that divine reality is like. It's probably going to remain an impersonal other, which can be glimpsed but not known. And even more problematic, what if people get conflicting messages about that sacredness? How do you begin to resolve that? So it outlines a fundamental problem with various forms of paganism. That is, spiritual movements which identify God with and limit God to the natural material world. How do you then ensure that that transcendence is true and good rather than deceptive and malevolent or whatever it is? And the truth is, getting stuck at that first point has meant some really quite abhorrent practices historically. And yes, the Church of Jesus Christ has been involved in terrible behaviour too. However, this is always clearly deviant from the ethical standards of the faith. We know it's wrong because it's in breach of our own internal framework, which describes what is good. We've got internal checks and balances. But that's the thing. The ethical framework is particular and distinct. So different religious traditions will have different ideas drawn from, fundamentally, what they claim the divine being or beings ask of us. Some of them might be very compatible with Christian teaching, some might be fine with a bit of tuning, and some may be completely in opposition. So, I am suspicious then of arguments for societal inclusivity which seems to sidestep this completely, or might rather patronisingly assume that people from different religious traditions, they're basically just Christians who wear different clothes and eat different foods and do some things differently. That if you get down to it, under the skin, everyone's just a nice Christian and has the same accompanying moral code. So if I were to take a little bit of a jab at some forms of liberal expressions of Christianity at a point, I'd say that kind of approach is just as dismissive and disrespectful of Christianity as it is of other religions. But if I was going to follow up the jab of the cross to some non-liberal forms of Christianity, I'd then say that complaining in a negative sense about Christians being social justice warriors is absurd. Because of course, social justice is linked to ethics and morals grounded in God's priorities. So I'm just going to punch up on everyone at this point. There's a real issue with progressing from intuition of divinity in creation to then knowing anything further about that and shaping life and behaviour accordingly. And I'm really sorry to be lazy at this point, but if you want to get a sense of how little we can take for granted on correct intuition of ethical behaviour, I would like to refer you to every civilization in history and whatever is in the newspaper on any day. There you go. But let's come from the other angle and frame things more positively. Because whilst people all around the world, they may have seen things through a glass darkly, God has been at work and living and active and truly connected with in civilizations around the world. And we should expect that. I want to say at this point, amid a lot of tragedy in the founding years and decades of the Australian colonies, in which there was at least an 80% reduction in the Aboriginal population through disease, war, persecution and more. When it was rare for clergy people to recognise that they didn't quite bring God with them on the boats when they came over. There are stories, more than a few, which reveal that Aboriginal people often found it quite intuitive to transpose their religious sensibilities into a Christian key. It's like the person of Jesus was known in some way. That there was clearly times when they could make that leap. I know about terrible things that went on, but the point is, Jesus was definitely here and discerned in some way. And we should expect that, because he is the heart of creation. It says at the opening of John's Gospel, all things came into being through him. In the letter to the Colossians, it's written that he is the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. Now, I do just want to say on that point, him being described there as the firstborn of creation doesn't mean that he's a creature within creation, as some heresies would claim. It's meant in the sense of Psalm 89 verse 27, which describes King David as the firstborn, who was obviously not the firstborn. So the phrase is about primacy, exaltedness. And at this point, I was writing and I realised I'm going on way too long here. I have to kind of leave the threads hanging until we pick this up more next week when we explore discerning God, the Holy Trinity, through creation. But I hope I'm not completely deluded in... I hope it excites your minds, actually. I really hope it does interest you and it makes you hungry to know more about how and why Jesus is so central. I really hope that's the case. The Lord be with you.